Good evening. My name's Niall Ferguson, and contrary to the slide you just saw, I'm no longer a professor at Harvard, but in fact, I'm based at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where I'm the Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Joe Nye is indeed at Harvard and has been a member of the Harvard faculty since the year I was born, 1964, which gives you an idea of who the senior participant in this dialogue is. Joe has been one of the leading lights at Harvard's Kennedy School, and during my 12 years at Harvard, one of the great pleasures was getting to know Joe and discussing on a regular basis with him our often contrasting views of the global geopolitical situation. So what I'm hoping is that this evening we'll be able to model that kind of civil disagreement that used to characterize academic life in a bygone era. Joe, it's a pleasure to see you. It's a little odd to be having a conversation in Moscow when we're both in rather remote locations in the United States. But although we're relatively isolated in this period of pandemic, we're both following closely the unfolding global situation. It's a little early, I think, to talk about a post-pandemic world. It certainly feels anything but post in the United States right now. But I thought I'd begin this session by asking you to assess how you think the pandemic has impacted the global balance of power, because there's a kind of conventional view emerging, and one reads it in many different journals, newspapers, and magazines, that China somehow won 2020 and the United States lost, despite the fact that, of course, the pandemic had its origins in China and initially hit China hardest. So how are you assessing the situation? It's now a year since we first began to realize that a global pandemic was on its way. Did China win?
Well, I think I agree with you, Neil, that in the short run of 2020, China did better. It did very badly at the beginning, but it got things under control. Trump administration was unable to get things under control, and you really had a terrible performance in the United States. I think the big question is, what do we see not in the short run, but in the medium run? I'm always struck, and I'd love to get your view on this, if we were having this debate about the geopolitical effects of the great influenza in 1918, and we were saying, would we predict how 1930 will look? How little impact the influenza had. There were enormous impacts, but they were mostly from World War I, and there was surprisingly little influence from the pandemic. And as a historian, so as we try to say, what will things look like in 2030 as a result of the pandemic, maybe it's not the pandemic which is the driver. Another way of putting it is, big causes don't always have big effects. But I'd be curious of lessons of history, what you think of how we understand that episode 100 years ago.
It's a great question, and viewers, you'll already have spotted that Joe is the international relations political science guy, and I am the history guy on this call. 1918-19's so-called Spanish influenza was much worse in terms of the mortality that it caused than COVID-19. And if you go back to March of last year, many people were worried that we were on the brink of an equally bad experience. COVID-19 is bad, but it's not as bad as 1918-19, which killed not only a larger number of people, almost certainly a larger share of the world's population, making it one of the top 10 pandemics in history, but it also killed a lot of young people. And that means that the quality adjusted life years lost, to use a technical term, really were much, much greater So it's a very good point you make, Joe. Looking back and trying to find the consequences of the 1918-19 influenza is almost impossible because you can't distinguish them from the consequences of World War I. One of the biggest consequences, certainly from a Russian vantage point, was, of course, the 1917 revolutions. Well, those happened before the influenza pandemic began because it didn't get going until the middle of 1918. And I don't think it actually had a significant impact on the unfolding of events in the Russian Empire. Typhus was probably a more important variable in the Russian Civil War than the influenza. On the other hand, the Spanish influenza, which was only called Spanish because the uncensored Spanish press were reporting on it, whereas the newspapers in combatant countries tended to play it down, probably did accelerate the end of the war. It's my view that one reason the German army collapsed in the middle of 1918 was actually sickness, which massively spiked in the German army. And it seems plausible, though one can't be sure now if it was indeed the Spanish influenza, that's one reason the fighting ended. But politically, it's really hard to disentangle. The United States was quite severely hit by the 1918-19 influenza, not as bad as some Latin American and Asian countries, but pretty hard hit. You'd probably be talking about 2 million deaths in terms of today's population. But what were the consequences? You can't disentangle them from the war, from the Red Scare, the fear that that communism might be spreading to the United States, and a whole other bunch of variables. So I think you're right to be skeptical. But let me put this to you. In just the same way as the Spanish influenza came as a world war was happening and influenced perhaps the timing of the end of that war, so COVID-19 came in the midst of what I call Cold War II. That is to say, that deterioration in relations between the United States and China that we'd been seeing certainly since Donald Trump became president, and I would argue from even earlier than that. And so the real significance of the pandemic was its impact on Cold War II, in that it made China the natural villain of the peace for many Americans and not just for Republicans. The deterioration of China's popularity in the world has been one of the striking features of the last 12 months. And I think one of the reasons it's not true that China somehow won 2020. So the way I think about this is that the pandemic has come at a time when Cold War II had already begun, and it has intensified the rivalry, the competition between Beijing and Washington, to the point that a new administration under Joe Biden can't actually stop it. It's kind of stuck with Cold War II, and the most that it can probably do is something like the détente of the 1970s. So how does that sound as an historical analogy?
Well, I think you and I can disagree on whether the terminology of Cold War II is better than what I call a cooperative rivalry. But the question I would ask, and I agree with you, that the trends in U.S.-China relations are very negative. I've written that the U.S.-China relationship is the worst it's been in 50 years. So I don't think we're disagreeing factually. The question I think, though, is still interesting is, would that be any different whether there'd been a pandemic or not? And that goes back to my analogy to 1918-19. These deeper trends were there. And it's not, and everybody, because we're obsessed with the current pain of the pandemic, everybody says, oh, this is going to be having a huge effect. I would argue that the current COVID-19 pandemic is accentuating pre-existing trends rather than reversing them. I would argue that, yes, worsening of U.S.-China relations, I agree. But I'm not, and the pandemic adds a bit to that because Trump kept referring to the China flu or the China virus and so forth. But I'm not sure that would have been all that different, even if there hadn't been a pandemic.
Well, professors love to debate semantics, so maybe we should resist that temptation and agree to disagree about the nomenclature, whether it's cooperative rivalry or just another Cold War. Let's consider the possibility that what happened in 2020 accentuated or accelerated this trend towards friction and rivalry between China and the United States. To my eyes, and here a Russian audience would be, I think, interested to comment. To my eyes, what happened in Wuhan back in December of 2019 and January of 2020 was Chernobyl writ large. Of course, we look back on Chernobyl as one of the key moments in the disintegration or at least decline and fall of the Soviet Union. But the thing about COVID-19 is that the culture of cover-up, which characterized the Communist Party in 1980s Russia, was also there in the China of 2019-2020, and that had disastrous consequences, to the extent that it wasn't until January the 23rd that there was an attempt to cut off the outflow of Chinese people, not just from Wuhan, but from all over China, that undoubtedly spread the virus to the rest of the world. Compared with Chernobyl, the Wuhan flu, which you're not allowed to call it, killed way, way more people. In fact, the death toll of Chernobyl was really quite modest, even in Ukraine itself. So this was a disaster of a much higher magnitude than the disaster of Chernobyl. And I think what it did was to validate the narrative of President Trump and his key national security team, Mike Pompeo, also at the National Security Council, Matt Pottinger, that China really was no better than the Soviet Union, that it was a communist-led state bent on not just competing with the United States, but actually harming it. And for me, the really interesting point is that that also began to sink in elsewhere. If you had gone back and asked Europeans in 2019 how they thought about the world, very few would have accepted the idea that China was a hostile force in global politics. That really changed last year. If one looks at the Pew surveys, massive increase in anti-Chinese sentiment in nearly every developed economy, and not only in Europe. One could see it in Asia, not least in India, though India wasn't surveyed by Pew. So I'm kind of inclined to argue that it did more than just accentuate an existing trend. I think it fundamentally changed views in the rest of the world about China and made the rest of the world, particularly Europe and India, much more open to the argument that China is the problem, and there needs to be, if not some strategy of containment, at least a strategy of contending with the Chinese challenge. I don't think you could make that argument in 2019 and get very far.
Well, that's an interesting point. I think both U.S. and China lost a good deal of soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And I think you're right that China's if we did a ledger of Chinese power before and after 2020, on the negative side of the ledger, we'd put what you just said, that China lost a good deal of soft power. The positive side of the ledger for China, it recovered more quickly, and its economy recovered more quickly. So you have Chinese net economic growth, probably, we don't know for certain because Chinese numbers are very suspect, but let's say that you have something like around 3% positive economic growth, whereas for the US, it's more like minus 3%. And what this has done is accelerated the period when the Chinese overall gross national product may exceed the American gross national product measured in current exchange rates. So people used to say it would happen sometime in the mid-2030s. Now maybe it'll be 2030. Or in other words, it may have advanced that crossover line on aggregate economic size by a few years. But that'll depend to some extent on what happens next in China and also what happens next in the United States under Biden. So I would argue China had a loss on soft power, gain on hard power. But again, I worry about extrapolating too much from these very short-term trends. I still think, in fact, that American hard power over the longer run, it remains quite impressive. If you look at the alliances that the Americans have that the Chinese don't have. Asia, as Bill Emmett pointed out some time ago, has its own internal balance of power. China has to worry about how it copes with Japan, the third largest economy in the world, and India, the largest population in the world. And the fact that those countries want American alliance because they fear the growth of China is a major asset for the U.S. In addition to questions like energy dependence, which Americans come out strongly, demographic change, where the population trends are better for the U.S. than China. So there's over the long run on hard power assets. I think the U.S. has got a lot of assets, and the fact that China may have a larger economy in terms of aggregate GDP measured in exchange rates, that's important, but it's not determining. So the question then is, how do we balance that ledger? Whether the Chinese loss of soft power is greater than this slight gain in hard power. And to me, that's still an open question.
Let's look ahead, as I think our duty on this call is to do some futurology. The Biden administration is just days away from being in power. And I'm going to sketch what I think is a plausible scenario for at least its first 2 years. Part one, the pandemic ends, or at least is brought under control to the point that normal life can resume. It ends in a combination of natural and vaccine generated herd immunity. It comes to an end faster than people expect, so that by May the 1st, everyone is pleasantly surprised to find that life is getting back to normal. Part two, because of this, and combined with fiscal and monetary stimulus that has not been seen in time of peace ever in American history, the US economy roars back to life this year, to the point that in the second half, people start worrying about inflationary pressures. Every kind of financial asset remains at stratospheric heights. And there is a sudden sense, to quote Joe Biden, that America is back because, part three, the administration reverts to a far more normal pattern of diplomacy compared with the Trump administration, and it's welcomed with open arms by Europeans and by America's Asian allies. So a year from now, things feel a lot different. Trumpism still exists, but it's a problem for the Republican Party rather than a threat to the Biden administration, because the divisions that Trump has left in his wake are very, very difficult for Republicans to overcome. Indeed, there is even a chance of a Trump party contesting the 2024 election. So I'm going to suggest that the bad year that the United States had in 2020 gives way to a really good year in 2021. And all that was said at the end of 2020 about the damage to American soft power, particularly the damage done by the events of January the 6th when a mob stopped the Capitol. All this is a suddenly distant memory, and it really does feel like America is back. Final point, China, grappling with financial problems as well as long-established demographic headwinds, doesn't perform as well in 2021 as the IMF and others project, because its policymakers have to focus on deleveraging to bring private household and corporate debt under control. And so 12 months from now, it no longer feels as if China won. It feels as if America is back. And in particular, because the American alliance system, which was so disrupted by Donald Trump, very quickly reforms itself. And it's China that begins to look isolated in Asia. And it's the US that is back to being the dominant player. How does that scenario strike you? And is there some bad news that I'm missing for the United States?
Well, I think that's quite a plausible scenario. Most of my economist colleagues here, your former colleagues, expect a robust recovery after the vaccine and after you get the stimulus you described. Most people are saying yes, it's going to be a V-shaped recovery at that point. So I think that part is plausible. I also think that the diplomatic part you described, that the alliances are going to be restored. That's been a high priority for Biden and for the people who are working for him. What will that look like in terms of U.S.-China relations is still a little bit uncertain. The Biden administration is going to put Kurt Campbell, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, actually my former deputy when I worked in the Pentagon. He's going to be in the White House in charge of an overall China policy, trying to pull together the various parts of the government on China policy. Now, Kurt has a reputation of something of a hawk on China, but I knowing him well, it's pretty balanced. In other words, he's not going to put up with some of the steps that China has taken to tilt the playing field in its favor in the past. But I don't think he has the same ideological thrust that, say, Pompeo had. And so I think you're going to see a tough U.S.-China relationship, but I don't think you're going to have that ideological edge to it that you saw in Pompeo. In those circumstances, I think you're going to see a continuation of this bad relationship, but not a continuing spiral downward. In other words, I would take your scenario and say, if the Chinese think that the Americans are in decline and they can press hard, I think that's not going to work. And I think you might find some sort of an equilibrium rather than a continued downward spiral, which you might have had if Trump had been reelected. But I know so yes, mostly yes. But with this question of will this level off or will it continue to get worse?
This is a great opportunity to take advantage of your network of former students who are now in an incoming administration, because it seems to me that one thing's very clear, reading Kurt Campbell's most recent publications and Jake Sullivan's, and following Tony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State's recent tweets on Chinese issues, we are not going back to 2015, 2016. We are not going back to the late Obama period when it seemed that administration had essentially given up on a pivot to Asia that would somehow check China's rise. In fact, I think we'll be amazed by the continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations on China policy. Let me ask you about something that I just read this week, an article by your former colleague, Kurt Campbell, in Foreign Affairs. I was pleasantly amazed by the article because it seemed to be one of those rare occasions when a policymaker accurately quotes Henry Kissinger. For those who haven't read it, Kurt Campbell argues that the right analogy for thinking about how the US deals with Asia is the analogy with Kissinger's account of how Britain dealt with Europe after the Napoleonic Wars in his first and some would say most brilliant book, A World Restored. Now, if that's the template for US strategy towards China, with Kurt Campbell in the driving seat as so-called Asia Tsar, or what is it, coordinator for the Indo-Pacific region, a term borrowed from the Trump administration, then China is definitely in for a challenging time, because the whole notion there is that the US should be a balancing power seeking to prevent any one power becoming dominant on the Asian landmass. And that one power, obviously, that has to be prevented from becoming dominant must be China. So I wonder, knowing him as you do, if I'm right to interpret this as a pretty profound shift in Democratic Party thinking about China compared with where we were pre-Trump.
Well, I think there's been definitely a shift in Democratic Party thinking, but it's even broader than that. Remember, back in the George W. Bush administration, when Bob Zoellick talked about aiming to make China a responsible stakeholder, which continues on in the Obama administration, there was a feeling that China, with economic growth and enrichment, would moderate, not become a democracy, but would moderate its behavior. Basically, that turned out to be a false expectation, in the sense that, particularly after Xi Jinping takes over, you can imagine Xi Jinping walking around Beijing with a little invisible hat, but a little red hat that says, "Make China great again." And he reverses Deng Xiaoping's "bide your time." He takes aggressive policy actions overseas, like building the artificial islands in the South China Sea, and tight party control at home, and tighter and tighter party control at home, cracks down in Hong Kong. I think that affected not just Democratic opinion, but affected American opinion more broadly. I've sometimes said that, I said this to an audience when I spoke in Beijing a couple of years ago. I said, you may lament the current fire in U.S.-China relations, but you have to ask who lit the fire. And frankly, you did. And Donald Trump came along and threw gasoline on the fire, so it flared up. But the fire really goes back to your actions. I think some Chinese are beginning to understand that. And I think Kurt Campbell, just to go back to your question about him, certainly saw that ahead of many other people in the Democratic Party. But it's not just Kurt, and it's not just or Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, though I think they're all terrific people to minister a policy or to guide a policy. I think it's a broad shift in American public opinion on China. And I think that my fault with China, with Trump administration, is not the direction that they were going, but the way they did it. I mean, putting tariffs on China made sense. Banning Huawei makes sense. But putting tariffs on our own allies and banning TikTok, and then the sort of the ideological tone that Pompeo took, all these, it seems to me, get in the way of proper management of a balance of power, which is what your allusion to the world restored makes clear. I think Kurt Campbell is going to continue the toughness of Trump policy, but without the ideological overlay. And I think that actually is healthy.
So if this is right, and I agree with everything that you've just said, particularly I agree with the point that it was really China that lit the fire, that if Cold War II is the right term, China started it, and the US really just reacted, I think rather belatedly reacted, and clumsily reacted. Now the US has a chance to, I think, handle China far more intelligently. And that implies an effort by the Biden administration to strengthen its relations with key Asian allies, Japan in the East, India in the South, and also South Korea. There's the thorny question of Taiwan, though, isn't there? If I were asking the question, what will be the flashpoint? that brings Cold War II close to hot war. The analogy with, I don't know, Berlin 61 or Cuba 62, I think it would be Taiwan. But the question is there a Taiwan crisis really soon? Or is it something that is going to come later? We know Xi Jinping regards bringing Taiwan back into the fold, not just de jure, but de facto, as his ultimate strategic goal. It's one of the reasons he got rid of the implicit term limits in Chinese politics. But I'm asking myself when this flares up, and if it flares up, how the Biden administration will respond. One thing that threw me was that I'd expected Michelle Flournoy to be defense secretary in the Biden administration, and she didn't get the job. It was pretty clear from her writing last year that she saw Taiwan as a key part of U.S. strategy, and that the U.S. should increase the credibility of its commitment to Taiwan. But I don't know what the incoming defense secretary is going to do in that regard. And I wonder what you think. It's a question I've discussed with our mutual friend, Dr. Kissinger. And his view, I think, is that there will be some kind of showdown, but not imminently, because the Chinese don't feel ready for a showdown. How do you think about Taiwan? Because it seems to me the obvious flashpoint in the US-China relationship.
Well, I agree with you. It's a very dangerous flashpoint. I still think it could be managed. There's some people who say that Xi Jinping, under domestic political pressure, is going to decide that he has to act quickly or soon. More people think that he's still deterred. If you want to ask what could disrupt the plans to have China successful at both its economy and policy, a war with the U.S. would be it. And it indeed is one of, according to Kevin Rudd and others, it's one of the things that could possibly lead to the unseating of Xi Jinping if he lost such a war. So I think she is going to be cautious. I have some friends who think, he feels the window is closing, he's got to act right away. I think he also feels deterred and realizes that this could be as Henry Kissinger warns, a 1914 moment, and not a 45, but a 14. And in that sense, I think what's been American policy on Taiwan, to oversimplify a diplomatic formula, is no declaration of de jure independence by Taiwan and no use of force by Beijing. And within that framework, the two sides of the Taiwan Strait arrange their relationship. For a long time, this was called strategic ambiguity. When I was in the Pentagon, I went to Beijing and was asked, would we defend Taiwan? And my comment to the Chinese government officials who were asking this is, it doesn't matter what I say, because you shouldn't believe me or any other American, because in 1950, the Secretary of State said Korea was outside our defense perimeter, and within 6 months we were at war. So you have to realize that the uncertainties here are sufficiently great that you'd better accept deterrence. The status quo is better. And that, I think, is what the Americans are trying to continue. And the question is, how much do we need to enhance deterrence to be able to do that? I think the answer I give is, yes, you want to enhance deterrence in terms of defense buildup and in terms of helping Taiwan with its weapons. You don't want to do the kinds of things that Trump is doing, which is sending the American UN ambassador to Beijing, to Taipei, and make it look as though the window is closing on the diplomatic recognition part of this. In other words, tighten the defense capabilities so that the costs are very clear, but don't poke a finger in China's eye in terms of Chinese domestic politics. I think that will be the approach that that the Biden administration will take, and that's different from the Trump administration, which kept nibbling away at this half of the equation, which related to Taiwan's de jure diplomatic status. But we'll have to see.
We've got just 10 minutes left of this conversation, and it would be remiss of me not to ask what the future holds for Russia, as this is a Russian event. I sense a kind of strange flipping of the geopolitical kaleidoscope. If one goes back to the 1970s, there was a falling apart of the relationship between the Soviet Union and China. In the period that you just alluded to, that of the Korean War, the partnership was close, but the Soviet Union was clearly the dominant partner. And Mao was in many ways duped by Stalin into fighting the Korean War on Stalin's behalf. So if we think about the geopolitical situation today, there's the same close relationship between Russia and China that there was in 1950, but China is the senior partner. And Russia is very clearly the junior partner. This relationship is very close. This is something that often is missed by Western commentators, how much Xi and President Putin see of one another and how much their thinking has become aligned. But from a historical point of view, it's actually anomalous. It's rare for Russia and China to be in such a close partnership. And an obvious question, once again, thinking in Kissinger terms, is what can the United States do to change that so that, as in Kissinger's time, Russia and China are each closer to the United States than they are to one another? Now, that seems an almost impossible task at this point, given the way that the US-Russian relationship has been frozen, in effect, certainly since 2014 and maybe for longer than that. Is there something the Biden administration can do to unfreeze the relationship? I avoid the word reset, so that the close proximity of Moscow to Beijing can, in some measure, be lessened. I wish I knew the answer to this. I really hope you do.
Well, I don't think anything's going to happen rapidly on this. Both Russia and China find it useful to coordinate their diplomacy because the Americans are such a nuisance. I mean, the Americans are an obstruction or a difficult country. And, if there's a natural diplomatic alliance of convenience between Russia and China, and that's not going to go away. On the other hand, with time, the gap between Russia and China is growing. In other words, as Chinese economic growth continues, you're finding that China is outstripping all of its partners in the BRICS. And the gap between them is increasing. At some point, that's got to make Russians feel uncomfortable. In other words, it's one thing to be the junior partner. It's another to get to be a smaller and smaller partner. So I think the Russians will have their own internal reasons for concern. Then the question is on the American relations with Russia. So that means there'll be some growth of distancing from China because of Russia's own concerns. On the American-Russian relationship, I don't think you can have, as you said, a reset or a sudden détente or so forth. But there are a number of practical steps that the Biden administration can take. One is to extend the strategic arms limitation talks. Another is to start talks about rules of the road for cyber. I've argued that the Russian approach, which is to have a verifiable treaty in the UN, doesn't work. You can't tell what's a cyber weapon and what's not. But you can do something like the 1972 Incidents at Sea Agreement, in which the US and the Soviet Union were at loggerheads ideologically, but both realized that the practices that they engaged in of close surveillance to make each other turn on radars and so forth ran the risk of carrying them over the brink, that there was an escalation danger. I think, if Biden were to send a top-level emissary to Putin and say, let's develop some rules of the road for cyber. We both are going to carry out cyber espionage, but there are limits. And let's talk about what those limits are and find procedures for how we deal with them. Remember, during the Cold War, when it came to espionage, there were what we called the rules of the road. We didn't execute each other's spies. We expelled them. And I think you could imagine the Biden administration doing some very practical things, both on the nuclear area and the cyber area, just based on self-interest of the US and the Russians. If that occurs, you're going to get some improvement in US-Russian relations at the same time that the natural economic forces are going to create some increased distance in China-Russia relations. And I think gradually that is a prospect for some more balance or equilibrium in the tripartite relationship.
We're almost out of time. We just have 4 minutes left. So let me offer one brief concluding observation and leave the last word to you. Sometimes as an historian, I get a little giddy looking at the world because I'm Atlantic man. And I think of you as an Atlantic man too, Joe. We've both spent part of our careers at Oxford and part at Harvard, and crossing the Atlantic was something that we both did a lot of, at least before 2020. And yet this world is a trans-Pacific world, a world in which the flashpoints are in Asia, and the issue really is who dominates the Indo-Pacific region, the US or China. And that's, I think, the thing that makes me giddy, because I just assume Europe's important, and I'm coming to the realization that it may not be all that important in this world. I used to assume the Middle East was vitally important, and it may not be in this world, particularly given the direction of energy policy in most countries. So Russia has a foothold in the Middle East. It has asserted its power, at least in Eastern Europe, with respect to Ukraine, but maybe it doesn't matter who is powerful in Eastern Europe and who is the power broker in the Middle East. Am I right in thinking that the world has flipped to a Pacific world rather than an Atlantic world? And was I therefore right to move to Stanford to the Pacific Rim and leave the Atlantic world behind? A last word to you, Joe.
Well, I wish you'd stayed in Cambridge, because I not only enjoyed your company, but I very much enjoyed the company of your wife. But we won't go there. On the larger question of the trend of yes, the world economy, as you know, in 1800, half of it was in Asia, and half the population was in Asia. By 1900, the world economy was 20% in Asia, because of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America. And what we're seeing in the latter part of the 20th century and this century is what you might call a restoration of normal proportions. So we are going to see, if you want, not the rise of Asia, but the recovery of Asia. And that means that Asia is much more than China. It's India and Japan and others. And that means that we are going to have to pay more diplomatic attention to Asia on many issues, like the South China Sea or Taiwan and so forth. We're going to have to work closely with India and Japan on maintaining a balance. But there's some global issues such as cyber, the use of artificial intelligence, new standards that are being set, in which the Europeans actually are extremely important and taking the lead in some areas. For example, privacy in the cyber realm. And so in that sense, the Europeans still have a role to play. It's not just that France occasionally sends some ships to join, Britain sends some ships to join in freedom navigation operations in the South China Sea. It's that the standards that are set in Europe, which affect privacy and the rise of the surveillance state in the cyber world, Europe's still very important there. And so I think, yes, for military affairs, we're going to have to think more in terms of Asia. But on some of these issues of the cyber domain, Europe's still going to be a very important ally.
Well, Joe, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I also miss Cambridge, where we could see one another more often without the intermediation of Zoom. This session, I think, has now reached its conclusion. We Atlantic men try to be punctual, so I'll simply encourage everybody who's listened to this to read Joe Nye on a regular basis if you don't already, wherever he is published, whether it's in Foreign Affairs or Project Syndicate. He's an indispensable guide to this extraordinarily complicated world we currently inhabit. I've hugely enjoyed this conversation. I hope it's been of interest to those viewing it or listening to it. And I wish everybody at the Gaidar Forum the very best of luck, and not too belated in Russian terms, Happy New Year. Thanks, everybody.
До свидания.
До свидания.
Goodbye.